The Göktürk Chronicles, Episode 2, Forging the Ashina Clan. In the winter of 515 AD, beneath the shadow of the Altai Mountains, 8-year-old Bumin Ashina learned a terrible truth about his people. Watching Rouran tax collectors strip away their finest horses and young men, seeing his proud father reduced to a submissive vassal, the boy had believed his clan were nothing more than slaves, useful servants to foreign masters who cared nothing for their dignity or dreams. But on that cold night, as shame and confusion tore at his young heart, his mother, Ay Hatun, revealed a different truth. She told him the legend of Ashina, the great blue wolf who had saved the last survivor of their people and given birth to the Ashina line in a hidden valley where divine wolves still roamed. She placed around his neck an ancient pendant, a silver wolf that had been passed down through 20 generations, and taught him that he was not born to be a slave, but a wolf waiting for his time to hunt. Yet legends alone could not answer the burning question that kept Bumin awake through the long night. If they were truly the children of Gök Börü, if their bloodline carried such sacred purpose, how had they fallen so far? How had the descendants of gods come to pay tribute to the Rouran Empire like any common vassal clan? On the second evening after the tribute collection, as the camp still mourned its losses and the wind carried the promise of harder times ahead, Bumin would learn that the path from divine origins to present subjugation was neither simple nor shameful, but rather a tale of mortal courage, impossible choices, and dreams that refused to die even in the darkest of times. This is where our story continues. The next evening brought no respite from winter's grip on the Altai foothills. If anything, the cold had deepened, seeping through felt walls and settling into bones with the persistence of an unwelcome guest. Outside the Ashina yurt, the sounds of a subdued camp drifted on the bitter wind, fewer voices than usual. The subdued conversations of families still counting the cost of yesterday's tribute collection. Bumin sat closer to the fire than was strictly proper. His young frame hunched against the cold, but his mind burned with questions that had kept him awake through the long night. The silver pendant his mother had given him rested warm against his chest, but instead of comfort, it brought a restless energy that made sitting still impossible. The evening meal had been smaller than usual. Barley porridge thinned with mare's milk, a handful of dried meat that should have lasted another week. The empty spaces where their finest horses had stood echoed in the thin broth. In the careful way his father portioned the food. In the silence that fell whenever someone's gaze turned toward the eastern edge of camp, where 15 families mourned sons taken for Rouran service. "Mother," he said suddenly, breaking the evening's quiet. Around the fire, everyone was doing their usual tasks. Tuwu checking his bow, Göktürk sharpening blades, old Börü preparing tomorrow's medicines. But their movements carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before the collectors came. "Yesterday you told us about Gök Börü and the first Ashina. But how did we get from the sacred valley to this?" The question hung there like an accusation. This, a clan barely big enough to matter, paying tribute to foreigners, watching their young men march off to serve in other people's wars. Istemi looked up from the wooden horse he was carving, his small knife pausing in its work. "Why are we giving them our horses?" he asked, the directness of a 5-year-old cutting through adult complexities. "If we're supposed to be wolves?" Tuwu stopped working on his bow. Göktürk's sharpening stone went quiet. The kid had a way of cutting right to the heart of things, even at 5 years old. Ay Hatun set down the coat she'd been mending, one of the garments that would have to last another winter, now that their tribute had depleted their trade goods. The needle glinted in the firelight as she placed it carefully in her sewing kit. a gesture that somehow carried the weight of ceremony. "You want the real story?" she said, her voice carrying that same measured cadence that had made the Ashina legend come alive the night before. Not the legend about our divine origins, but how a handful of wanderers became a clan that could challenge empires. "Yes," Bumin said, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the pendant through his shirt. "I want to understand how we went from being Gök Börü's children to yesterday." His mother studied his face in the dancing light, seeing not just curiosity, but a deeper hunger, the need to understand the weight of history that pressed down on their yurt like the winter sky itself. Around the fire, the other adults had grown still, their tasks forgotten. Even old Börü had stopped grinding his herbs, his rheumy eyes reflecting something that might have been anticipation or dread. "Very well," she said finally. "But this story is different from yesterday's tale. There are no miraculous wolves in it, no divine interventions, only men and women making choices that echo down through generations." She leaned back, her voice taking on that same storytelling rhythm, but different somehow. Less mystical, more measured, like a chronicler recounting events that had shaped nations. The fire seemed to burn steadier as she began, as if the flames themselves were listening. "This is the story my grandfather told me, the story of Ashina the founder, who came down from the hidden valley to forge a people from scattered fragments. In the time when the Altai mountains were younger and the paths between peaks less traveled, when the great steppes knew only the tracks of wild horses and the camps of wandering hunters, Ashina the Wolfborn descended from his mother's sacred valley with 4 of his brothers and a vision that would reshape the world. They were no longer the half-divine children of legend, but mortal men carrying an immortal purpose. Each bore the gifts their mother had bestowed: Ashina's wisdom to see patterns in the chaos of tribal politics, Barish's skill with horses that could gentle the wildest stallion with a touch, Kaban's strength that could bend iron with his bare hands, Demir's cunning that could turn enemy against enemy with carefully chosen words. The 5th brother, Tash Han, had chosen to remain in the valley as guardian of their sacred origins, but his blessing went with them into the world of men. They brought little beyond their skills and their mother's promise. A few horses whose bloodlines carried the magic of the sacred valley. Weapons forged in hidden smithies where the techniques had been perfected over generations. And most precious of all, knowledge of the old ways that other tribes had begun to forget in their struggles for survival. But they carried something else as well: the memory of greatness lost. The bitter knowledge of how quickly empires could fall when unity cracked and enemies pressed their advantage. Ashina's father had been among those who fled the southern valleys when the soldiers in black armor came from beyond the Great Wall, destroying the last remnants of the confederation their ancestors had built. That great realm, the Hun Empire that had once made even the Middle Kingdom tremble, had once stretched from the eastern forests to the western seas. A mighty empire of horsemen who had ruled the steppes for generations beyond count. But internal feuds had weakened it. Drought had scattered the herds, and ambitious generals had seen opportunity in division. When the end came, it came swiftly. City-states falling one by one, great khans reduced to fugitives, proud warriors selling their swords to foreign masters just to feed their families. Some had fled west to distant lands where the sun sets. Others had bent the knee to their conquerors. Still others had sought refuge in the hidden places of the world. Ashina's line had chosen exile over submission, carrying the sacred bloodline into the mountains, where Gök Börü could protect and preserve it until the time was right for renewal. But the lesson of that disaster burned in their hearts like an unhealing wound. That strength without unity was merely violence. That individual courage without collective purpose was just another form of death. The world they entered was not the unified realm of their ancestors' glory days, but a patchwork of competing clans scratching out existence in an increasingly harsh landscape. The great confederation of their forefathers, the mighty realm that the southern chroniclers had called Xiongnu, had shattered generations ago under the hammering of Chinese armies and the pressure of changing times. The descendants of that great people had scattered like leaves before winter wind, some fleeing west to distant lands beyond the great mountains, others seeking shelter in hidden valleys, still others bending the knee to new masters in exchange for survival. The Toulouse Confederation held the richest grasslands to the east, their numbers swollen by refugees from tribal wars that had consumed smaller groups like wildfire consuming dry grass. The Bugu controlled the mountain passes that connected steppe to forest, extracting tribute from traders and migrants who needed safe passage between the two worlds. Dozens of smaller groups wandered between territories, seeking winter shelter and summer pasture, always one bad season away from starvation or absorption by stronger neighbors. Into this fractured world came Ashina with his handful of followers, seeking not conquest, but a place where the children of Gök Börü could take root and grow strong again. Their first winter nearly destroyed them. They had claimed a valley in the southern reaches of the Altai, drawn by its sheltered position and the sweet grass that grew there in summer abundance. But winter revealed what summer had hidden. The valley was a trap when the snows came. The narrow entrance easily blocked by avalanches that could seal them in for months. Worse, they discovered too late that the Bugu considered this particular valley part of their traditional territory, used for sheltering their own herds during the harshest months. The confrontation came with the first heavy snowfall, when a Bugu war party led by their chief Ayuk found Ashina's small band huddled around fires of dried horse dung, their breath white in the frigid air. The sound of approaching hoofbeats had silenced their camp. 40 mounted warriors appearing through the swirling snow like spirits of winter itself. "You're on our land," Ayuk said bluntly, his voice carrying across the quiet valley. His warriors spread out behind him in practiced formation, their horses pawing at the snow, breath steaming in the cold. Every man among them carried weapons that had seen use. Notched blades, scarred shields, the practical gear of fighters who had survived more than one campaign. "This is our winter camp. Who said you could just set up here?" Ashina got to his feet slowly, looking at the faces around him. 40 against 7, not good odds, even with the gifts Gök Börü had bestowed upon them. But something made the Bugu chief hold back instead of just attacking outright. Perhaps the quality of their horses, perhaps the way Ashina's brothers positioned themselves with the fluid grace of men who had never known defeat. "We need shelter," Ashina said simply, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Same as you. We're Turk, you're Turk. Winter law says you don't turn people away when it's this cold." It was a calculated gamble, invoking the ancient Torah that governed relations between the tribes. The law of winter hospitality was sacred among the Turk peoples. No clan could turn away travelers seeking shelter during the killing months, provided they could contribute to the community's survival and did not overstay their welcome. But the law assumed the supplicants were guests, not permanent residents claiming territory that belonged to others. Ayuk's scarred face twisted with something between amusement and irritation. Winter law? You think you can just squat in our valley and call it hospitality? His horse stamped impatiently, sensing its rider's mood. What have you got that's worth feeding 7 extra mouths all winter? The question hung there while snow continued to fall, each flake adding to the growing barrier that would soon make travel impossible. Ashina felt his brother's eyes on him, knew that his next words would determine whether they saw spring or died here in this valley that they had hoped would be their salvation. But then one of the young Bugu riders pointed at their horses with something approaching wonder in his voice. Chief, look at those animals. Have you ever seen horses like that? Ayuk followed his gaze, and his whole attitude shifted. The horses they'd brought from the valley were different. Bigger than steppe ponies, but more graceful than farm horses, with coats that seemed to catch and hold the weak winter light in ways that made them appear almost ethereal. They moved with an intelligence that ordinary horses rarely displayed, as if they understood not just commands, but the intentions behind them. Where'd you get horses like that? Ayuk demanded. And now there was genuine interest in his voice, the calculating look of a man who understood the value of superior bloodlines. Ashina smiled slightly, recognizing the opening he needed. My brother breeds them. Give him time with your herds, and he can make your horses like ours. The claim sent a visible ripple through the Bugu warriors. Horses were the foundation of steppe life. Wealth, mobility, status, and military power, all measured in the quality of a clan's herds. A master horse breeder was worth 12 ordinary warriors to any chief with the wisdom to recognize true value. Prove it, Ayuk said after a long moment of calculation, his eyes moving from the magnificent animals to the confident faces of the men who rode them. Your brother will work with our herds through the winter. If he can improve our bloodlines as you claim, we will discuss more permanent arrangements in the spring. If not, he left the threat unspoken, but his hand rested meaningfully on his sword hilt. And so began the first alliance of the Ashina, not through conquest or inheritance, but through the demonstration of skills that made them valuable to their neighbors. Barish spent the winter months working with the Bugu herds, his almost supernatural understanding of equine nature allowing him to identify the strongest bloodlines and plan breedings that would produce superior offspring. He could look at a mare and know not just her current condition, but the quality of colts she would bear. Could gentle a stallion that had never accepted a rider. Could sense sickness in animals before any symptoms appeared. By spring, when the snows melted and revealed green grass beneath, he had earned a reputation that reached far beyond the Bugu camps. Traders who came through the passes spoke of the miraculous horsemaster who could transform a mediocre animal into something worthy of a Khan's personal mount. But it was Ashina himself who proved the most valuable addition to their hosts. Chief Ayuk was a capable war leader, but no diplomat. His direct nature serving him poorly in the complex negotiations that governed intertribal relations. Ashina's ability to see the larger patterns of steppe politics, to understand how seemingly unrelated events might cascade into opportunities or disasters, made him an invaluable advisor. When the Tolos Federation sent envoys demanding tribute for passage rights through traditional Bugu territory, it was Ashina who crafted the response that turned insult into alliance. Rather than reject the demand outright, which would have meant war against superior numbers, or submit to it, which would have meant permanent subjugation, he proposed a counteroffer that acknowledged Tolos' strength while preserving Bugu independence. The Bugu people recognized the might of the Tolos Federation, he had the envoys told, his words carefully chosen to honor without groveling, and wished to demonstrate our respect through a gift worthy of such great warriors. Instead of tribute, he arranged for the Bugu to provide horses to the Tulos, animals bred by Berish's methods that were superior to anything in the Federation's herds. But the arrangement was framed as a trade relationship between equals rather than submission by vassals, preserving face for both sides while creating economic incentives for peace. The success of this diplomacy impressed not only the Bugu, but other smaller clans who had watched the negotiations with keen interest. By the end of that first year, delegations began arriving at Ayuk's camp, seeking to meet the mysterious advisor whose wisdom had turned potential catastrophe into prosperity. It was during the autumn gathering, a traditional festival where scattered clans came together to trade, arrange marriages, and share news before winter separated them again, that Ashina first witnessed the rituals that would become central to his people's future identity. The festival took place in a sacred valley where 3 rivers met, their waters considered blessed by Göktürk himself. For 7 days, the competing clans set aside their feuds and disputes to participate in ceremonies older than memory. Khams from every tribe contributed to great fires that burned day and night, the smoke carrying prayers and offerings up to the eternal blue sky. The scent of burning juniper and sacred herbs filled the air, while drums echoed off the valley walls in rhythms that seemed to make the very earth pulse with life. On the central day of the festival, when Göktürk's favor was strongest, the assembled tribes held a great toy, a council where matters affecting all the Turk peoples could be discussed and decided. It was here that Ashina first witnessed the power of traditional law, the Torah that governed everything from marriage negotiations to territorial disputes. The toy was led by the eldest Kham present, a wizened Tolos named Ultengri, whose connection to the spirit world was legendary among the tribes. His voice, cracked with age but still carrying the authority of one who spoke with spirits, opened the proceedings with prayers that seemed to make the very air tremble with divine presence. "We gather beneath the eternal sky," Ultengri intoned, his words echoing off the valley walls. "As our fathers gathered, and their fathers before them, here in this sacred place, we remember that though we bear different names and follow different leaders, we are one people under Göktürk's protection." The matters brought before the toy ranged from the practical to the profound. Disputes over grazing rights were resolved through ancient precedents and careful negotiation, with Khams consulting omens and reading the patterns of wind and flame to determine the will of heaven. Marriage alliances were proposed and debated, with both families and spiritual advisors weighing the compatibility not just of individuals, but of clan spirits and ancestral bloodlines. Trade agreements were formalized with ritual exchanges of gifts that bound the participants in bonds stronger than mere contracts. But it was the final item of business that captured Ashina's attention most completely. A delegation from the eastern edges of Turk territory brought disturbing news of a new power rising beyond the traditional boundaries of their world, a threat that stirred memories of the disasters that had scattered their ancestors from their original homeland in the far southern valleys, where the great rivers flow toward the morning sun. "The Rouran are getting stronger," the messenger said, his voice carrying across the gathered chiefs like the call of a hawk warning of approaching storms. "They've united all the clans beyond the Gobi. We're talking about tens of thousands of warriors, all following one Khan." Worried murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Everyone knew about the Rouran. They had been a presence on the far horizon for generations, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, always distant enough to ignore. But since the great Khan Yu Cheng had forged them into a true empire, everything had changed. His successors had continued his work of conquest and consolidation, and now every chief present could read the implications in the messenger's grim expression. "They're making everyone an offer," the messenger continued, his words falling into a silence that had grown heavy with dread. "Submit now and keep some of your freedom, or fight and get crushed. 7 clans have already given in. Their men serve Rouran masters. Their children are taken as hostages to ensure good behavior. Their chiefs do what they're told." The arguments that erupted after this revelation continued through the night and into the next day. Some chiefs wanted to fight immediately, rallying all the Turk clans for a preemptive strike before the Rouran could grow any stronger. Others counseled caution, pointing out that they knew little about Rouran military capabilities and that hasty action could bring disaster upon them all. A few, the pragmatists who had learned to read the currents of power, quietly suggested that perhaps accommodation could be reached, that the Rouran might be willing to accept nominal submission in exchange for allowing the tribes to maintain their traditional ways. Finally, when voices had grown hoarse and tempers had reached the breaking point, Ashina stood up. The toy fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward the man whose reputation for wisdom had begun to spread across the steppes. "Listen," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "We're talking like we have a choice between winning and losing. But this messenger just told us what choice the Rouran really give us. Bend the knee or die. I don't like either option." He let that sink in for a moment, his gaze moving across the assembled faces, seeing fear and anger and confusion written there. "But we shouldn't rush into a war that'll get us all killed either. The Rouran are strong because they stick together. We're still fighting each other over old grudges and ancient territorial disputes. Want to stay free? First, we need to prove we deserve it by acting like one people instead of 20 different tribes." His proposal was ambitious, almost to the point of impossibility. A formal confederation of the Turk tribes that would preserve their individual identities while creating collective strength to resist external threats. Each clan would retain its traditional territories and leadership, but all would contribute to common defense and be bound by shared commitment to the ancient Ture. The debate that followed stretched through 3 more days, with countless details to be negotiated and ancient grievances to be addressed. How would military command be structured? Who would arbitrate disputes between member clans? How could they ensure that larger tribes didn't dominate smaller ones? What about clans that chose not to join? Would they be considered enemies or merely neutrals? But gradually, through patient negotiation and careful compromise, Ashina's vision began to take shape. The smaller clans, threatened by Rouran expansion, but too weak to resist alone, were the first to embrace the idea. They had everything to gain from collective security and little to lose, since their independence was already hanging by a thread. The larger federations took more convincing, but even they could see the wisdom of unity in the face of existential threat. The Tolos, despite their own considerable strength, recognized that even they might not be able to stand alone against a united Rouran empire. Better to be first among equals in a Turk confederation than to face annihilation or absorption into a foreign empire. The negotiations were delicate, fraught with the accumulated grievances of generations. Old blood feuds had to be set aside, territorial disputes resolved, questions of precedence and honor carefully balanced. Who would lead in times of war? How would tribute and military obligations be divided? What happened if member clans had internal disputes? Would the Confederation intervene or remain neutral? Ashina proved masterful at these discussions, drawing on his understanding of both human nature and political necessity. He proposed a rotating leadership system for military campaigns, with command going to whichever clan had the most at stake in each particular conflict. He established clear protocols for internal disputes. Mediation first through neutral cams, then judgment by a council of chiefs, and only as a last resort expulsion from the Confederation. Most importantly, he insisted that the Confederation's laws be written down and preserved, carved into stone tablets that could not be altered by convenience or corrupted by time. These would be kept in the sacred valley where they had first sworn their oaths, guarded by Khams who served the Confederation rather than any individual clan. By the festival's end, the foundation of what would become the Ashina Confederation had been laid. It was not yet the mighty empire that would one day challenge China and Rome, but it was a beginning, the first step toward transforming Gök Börü's scattered children into a force that could reshape the world. The years that followed tested every aspect of Ashina's emerging confederation. The Rouran, sensing potential resistance to their expansion, began probing the new alliance with raids and diplomatic pressure designed to fracture it before it could solidify. They would strike at isolated settlements, then retreat before Confederation forces could respond, or send envoys bearing impossible demands and veiled threats to member clans. Rival Turk clans who had refused to join the Confederation attempted to exploit any signs of weakness, hoping to profit from playing both sides. They would raid Confederation territory, then claim it was merely traditional rivalry or offer information to the Rouran about Confederation movements and capabilities. Through it all, Ashina proved himself not just a visionary, but a practical leader capable of holding together the fragile bonds of tribal alliance. When the Bugu faced a harsh winter that threatened their herds with starvation, he arranged for emergency relief from more prosperous Confederation members, ensuring that aid was given freely rather than as debt that might create resentment. When young warriors from different clans clashed over matters of honor, he instituted tournaments and competitions that channeled their aggression into constructive rivalry while building bonds of friendship across tribal lines. Most importantly, he began the systematic preservation and codification of the Torah that would bind his people together across generations. Working with Khams from every tribe, he compiled the traditional laws and customs into a coherent system that could be taught and enforced consistently throughout Confederation territory. Marriage customs, inheritance rights, trade regulations, military obligations, all were carefully recorded and harmonized so that a Turk from one end of the Confederation could travel to the other and know exactly what was expected of him. The ceremony that marked the formal establishment took place in the winter of Ashina's 7th year as a leader. It was held not in the sacred valley where the autumn festivals occurred, but on a wind-swept plateau high in the Altai mountains, where his mother's valley remained hidden among the peaks. Representatives from every member clan gathered as Ashina knelt before a great fire built from wood taken from the sacred groves of each tribe. The smoke rose straight up into the clear winter sky, carrying with it the prayers and aspirations of a people determined to remain free. Gök Tengri, Ashina prayed, his voice carrying across the assembled throng. Witness the oath we make this day. As you gave us life and freedom, so we pledge to preserve both for our children and their children after them. Let no foreign master claim dominion over the children of the wolf. Let no threat divide what common purpose has united. The oath taken that day would echo through generations, binding the Ashina and their allies in common cause. The confederation grew stronger each year, absorbing smaller tribes that sought protection, establishing trade relationships that brought prosperity, developing military tactics that made them feared by their enemies. But even as they celebrated their unity and growing strength, darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Rouran had spent the years of Ashina's confederation building consolidating their own power, absorbing smaller tribes not through alliance, but through conquest, perfecting their military organization until they could field armies larger than anything the steppes had ever seen. The test of strength that would determine the fate of both peoples was inevitable, and with it, the choices that would shape the world for generations to come. For 3 generations, the Confederation held them off. Ashina's sons and grandsons proved worthy heirs to his vision, maintaining the unity he had built while adapting to new challenges. They fought the Rouran in great battles that left valleys strewn with the dead, raided their supply lines, formed temporary alliances with other enemies of the growing empire. The first great test came during the reign of Ashina's son, when a Rouran army 50,000 strong swept down from the northern wastes like a plague of locusts. The Turk forces that met them numbered barely half that. But they had advantages the enemy lacked: intimate knowledge of the terrain, superior mobility, and most importantly, the unified command structure built. For 3 years, the war raged across the steppes. The Rouran would win great victories, capturing important towns and scattering Turk armies, only to find their conquests evaporating like morning mist when they tried to consolidate their gains. The Confederation had learned the lessons of their ancestors' defeat. Never give the enemy a fixed target, never commit all your forces to a single battle. Always preserve the capability to continue the fight, even after apparent defeat. They developed new tactics to exploit Rouran weaknesses. Swift cavalry raids would strike at supply trains and isolated garrisons, then vanish into terrain the enemy couldn't navigate. Allied clans would feign submission, then rise in rebellion when Rouran forces were committed elsewhere. Most effective of all, they learned to turn the Rouran's own vassals against them, offering better terms to subject peoples who chafed under foreign rule. But the Rouran adapted too. Their second invasion came with different tactics. Instead of seeking decisive battles, they focused on systematic conquest and occupation. They built fortified camps at strategic locations, established reliable supply lines, and most ominously, began recruiting from conquered populations rather than relying solely on their own warriors. The pattern continued through Ashina's grandson's reign and into that of his great-grandson. Each generation of leaders learned new lessons, developed new strategies, found new ways to preserve their independence against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing decade. But the fundamental mathematics of the conflict never changed. The Rouran could afford losses that would cripple the Confederation. They could replace fallen warriors with fresh recruits. They could sustain campaigns across multiple seasons, while the Turk had to constantly balance military needs against the requirements of their herds and families. But the Rouran had learned what Ashina tried to teach his own people: that unity was strength, that a coordinated empire could overcome scattered tribes no matter how brave. They didn't come as raiders looking for quick plunder and easy slaves. They came to conquer and stay. And they were willing to lose more men than the Confederation could afford to spare. The final war began in winter, when the Rouran struck simultaneously at Confederation forces scattered across their traditional winter camps. They had spent years learning the patterns of Turk seasonal movement, identifying the valleys and sheltered plains where the tribes would be most vulnerable. The attacks were coordinated with a precision that spoke of long planning and careful intelligence gathering. Clearly, someone among the Confederation leadership had been feeding information to the enemy. This betrayal cut deeper than any military defeat. The Confederation had survived for generations because trust bound it together more strongly than any law or treaty. When that trust cracked, everything else began to crumble. Clans that had stood together against external enemies suddenly found themselves questioning each other's loyalty. Chiefs who had fought side by side for decades began to wonder if their allies might be the next to sell them out for Rouran gold. The war that followed was unlike any that had come before. Instead of the mobile campaigns that had characterized earlier conflicts, this became a grinding war of attrition fought in winter conditions that killed almost as many men as enemy weapons. The Rouran had learned patience. They no longer sought quick victory, but steady progress, consolidating each gain before moving to the next objective. One by one, the Confederation's strongholds fell. Not through lack of courage. The Turk fought like the wolves they claimed as ancestors, selling every mile of ground at terrible cost to their enemies. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of warfare, when the enemy could replace 2 fallen warriors for everyone you lost, when they could afford to lose entire armies in exchange for strategic positions, when they fought not for glory or loot, but for the systematic extermination of Turk independence. The siege of the Sacred Valley, where the Confederation had first been sworn, lasted through an entire winter. Surrounded by 10 times their number, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, the defenders held out not because they expected relief, but because surrender meant the end of everything their ancestors had built. When spring came and the snows melted, the valley floor was carpeted with the dead of both armies. But the Rouran could afford such losses, while the Confederation could not. The end came not in a single great battle, but in a moment of terrible choice. Ashina's great-grandson, Tu Wu's grandfather, found himself surrounded in the same valley where the Confederation had first been sworn into existence. The Rouran offered terms: surrender now, accept vassal status, and the Ashina bloodline would be preserved. Their people would live, though they would serve foreign masters. Continue fighting, and every man, woman, and child who bore the name Ashina would be put to the sword. Their bloodline erased from the world as completely as if they had never existed. It was not cowardice that made him choose submission. It was the terrible wisdom of a leader who understood that survival without honor was still survival, while honor without survival was merely an elaborate form of suicide. He thought of the children playing in camps throughout Confederation territory, of the women who tended herds and kept alive the songs of their ancestors, of the young men who might one day have the chance to reclaim what he was about to surrender. Most of all, he thought of the lessons learned from his ancestors' earlier defeat, that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting to the death, but in living to fight another day, in preserving what could be preserved so that future generations might rebuild what had been lost. The surrender ceremony took place on the same plateau where Ashina had first sworn the Confederation oath. But instead of Turk representatives gathering to pledge unity, it was Rouran officials accepting the submission of a defeated people. The wolf banners that had flown proudly for 3 generations were lowered and replaced with the symbols of a foreign empire. The terms of surrender were harsh, but not entirely without mercy. The Ashina bloodline would be preserved, but as tributary chiefs serving Rouran interests. Their warriors would serve in Rouran armies. Their horses would stalk Rouran herds. Their young people would be taken as hostages to ensure continued obedience. The confederation was formally dissolved, its member clans scattered to prevent any future unity. Most painful of all, the sacred laws carved in stone were broken and scattered, their fragments used to build foundations for Rouran garrison posts. The written record of Turk justice and tradition was systematically destroyed, leaving only what could be preserved in human memory. Songs and stories passed down from parent to child, growing dimmer with each generation that lived under foreign rule. But the Rouran made one crucial error in their moment of triumph. They believed that breaking the confederation meant breaking the spirit that had created it. They thought that by scattering the clans and humbling the chiefs, they could transform wolves into dogs permanently. They failed to understand that Ashina's greatest creation was not a political structure, but an idea. The vision of what the Turk people could become when they stood together as one. That idea survived in places the conquerors could not reach. It lived in the pendant that now rested against Bumin's chest, in the stories that mothers told their children, in the dreams of young men who had never known freedom, but somehow still remembered what it felt like. It waited in the songs of wandering bards and the prayers of Khams who served spirits older than any empire. And so the children of Gök Börü became servants. Their confederation dissolved, their leaders reduced to petty chiefs administering tribute collection and providing soldiers for their conquerors' armies. The dream of unity was not destroyed. It was simply buried, waiting for the day when someone would be brave enough to dig it up again, wise enough to learn from the mistakes of the past, and strong enough to build something that even the Rouran could not tear down. And that's how it all came apart, Ay Hatun said, bringing the story back to their yurt. The fire had burned down while she spoke, shadows growing longer around them. Ashina's confederation lasted 3 generations, getting stronger each year. But so did the Rouran. Bumin leaned forward, the pendant warm against his chest. But they fought back, right? They didn't just give up. His mother's face darkened. Oh, we sure fought. Held them off for longer than anyone thought possible. But the Rouran had learned what Ashina tried to teach us, that you're stronger when you stick together. They didn't come as raiders looking for quick loot. They came to conquer and stay. And they were willing to lose more men than we could afford to. She touched the pendant at Bumin's throat, her fingers tracing the wolf's form through the fabric of his shirt. Your great-great-grandfather made the choice that kept our people alive, but cost us our freedom. When fighting meant the end of the Ashina bloodline, he chose to bend the knee instead. He gave up our pride so maybe his great-grandchildren could stand tall again someday. The weight of that decision settled over them like the winter cold seeping through the yurt walls. Bumin finally understood why his father looked so beaten down yesterday. Why giving in came so easily to men whose ancestors had built confederations. They weren't cowards. They were carrying the burden of an impossible choice made by someone who loved his people more than his own honor. But we're still here, Istemi said quietly. looking up from his wooden horse. "We didn't disappear like those other people did." "No," their mother said, pulling both boys close to her sides. "We're still here, still remembering, still carrying Ashina's dream, even if we have to hide it." She looked at Bumin across the dying fire. "The confederation your ancestor built isn't dead, little wolf. It's just sleeping, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up." Outside, the wind carried new sounds, the distant howl of wolves somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. Bumin listened to that wild cry and felt something stir in his chest, some echo of the freedom his ancestors had known, the unity they had built, the choices they had made. The pendant against his skin seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to his thoughts. He was beginning to understand that the story his mother had told wasn't really about the past at all. It was about the future, and the choices that would determine whether the children of Gök Börü remained servants or reclaimed their birthright as wolves. In the dying firelight, he caught his father's eye across the yurt. For just a moment, he saw something there that hadn't been present the night before. Not the defeated resignation of a vassal chief, but the calculating look of a man beginning to remember that he was the heir to confederation builders. The wolves howled again in the distance, and this time their cry sounded less like mourning and more like a promise.